Well, it's good to see everyone start coming in at 1:30. I think I wasn't quite clear. It's 1:30 seated. My apology. Awesome. All right, welcome back. So I trust everyone had a good lunch and able to stretch yourself over the last hour or so, and be ready for part 2 of this afternoon session that we're going to talk about science and Christianity. But there are quite a number of questions that stem through from this morning's session topic. So we do respect your questions. While we didn't have time to go through all the questions, but we're going to share those questions to our speaker after today's session. So thank you so much for making time to send through your questions from this morning's topic. Now, this afternoon, so we'll talk about science and Christianity. So Dr. Martin will spend 30 minutes or so to kickstart for us, followed by Dr. Lewis, yes. It doesn't matter? Oh, good? Okay, cool. All right, very polite. Good to go? All right, excellent. So the stage is yours, Dr. Martin.
Change my glasses. One pair of glasses I can see up to this far, the other pair see from this far onwards, and somewhere in the middle I have this blind spot. But that's good, now I can see. And we've got, do we have our PowerPoint? Ah, there he is, good, my scientist is there, wonderful. This is my scientist who's going to be helping throughout the presentation this afternoon. Well, in the first talks, we looked at the issue of young Earth, old Earth. This time, in these two talks, we're going to be just zooming back a bit and talking about the bigger issue of the relationship between science and Christianity more general. I've got the hard job now of trying to keep you awake after such a yummy lunch. Everyone's feeling a bit full and sleepy, so I hope, may God grant me the grace to do that. But thank you to CrossCulture for such a delicious lunch and for being such wonderful and generous hosts. So, well, in my first talk, I argued that the Bible alone tells the true story of the world, that it is public truth, not private truth. And I argued that it begins with the creation of all things, and then it ends with the renewal of all things. And in between, I argued, it tells of how after the entrance of sin and death into the world, according to one of my favorite Reformed statements, we can go to the next slide there, we read that the Lord set out on the long road of redemption to reclaim the lost as his people and the world as his kingdom. And we said that it's only within the context of this story, the story of the Bible, that we find the true meaning of who Jesus is and what he came to do. Another way of saying it is this: the gospel can only be rightly understood when it's viewed through the lens of a biblical worldview. Each of us has adopted one, whether we realize it or not, a worldview that is. Principles and precepts, elements and beliefs shape the way that each of us view the world around us. Once a worldview is established, we view and we interpret everything around us, dependent on those beliefs and values that have shaped and coloured our worldview lenses. Every human being has a worldview. But the question is this: do you have a biblical worldview? For how can you hope to follow Christ without learning to see the world as he sees it? And how can you think the way Jesus thinks? How can you have the mind of Christ if you don't see the world and think about the world as he does? As Craig Bartholomew, who's written quite a lot on the topic of worldview, writes, He says God's glory is at stake in how we see and live in the world. And so too is the well-being of humankind. We owe it to God, to our neighbour, to ourselves, and to his world to allow Scripture to polish the lenses of our glasses until they too are aflame with the grandeur of God in his revelation and creation. Thus, not only must our understanding of the gospel be shaped by the biblical story, which in turn is the basis of our Christian worldview, but our understanding of all reality, which includes creation and science, must also be shaped by a biblical worldview. A worldview that is shaped and grounded in the biblical story. Now, I'm going to introduce you to one of my favourite theologians who's taught me a lot about this. His name is Abraham Kuyper. He was a journalist, a theologian, and the Prime Minister of Amsterdam, of the Netherlands between 1901 and 1905. And in a speech delivered at the opening of the Free University of Amsterdam, Kuyper uttered these now famous words. He said, "Oh, no single piece of our mental world is to be hermetically sealed off from the rest. And there is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, 'Mine.'" In other words, Christ's sovereign rule extends over all of our lives. Every sphere of life is to be lived out, to use a favourite Kuyperian term, coram Deo, before the face of God. And so the following diagram here captures what I'm talking about. And we see that Christ is sovereign over every sphere of life: church, state, family, art, science, whatever sphere of life. By contrast, the secular worldview wants to liberate all of these spheres from Christ's control. If there is a God, the secularist says, he can have the church, but nothing else. And so under secularism, our diagram looks now like this. The Christian community must live out its calling, and specifically today, its calling to do science under the lordship of Jesus Christ and for his glory. But the question is this: if doing science is an expression of the Christian faith, how is it that non-Christians are able to do such great science? Well, here's where Abraham Kuyper helped me again. Abraham Kuyper's answer was that God gives common grace to all people. On the one hand, to restrain the power and the effects of sin so that we're not as bad as we could be. And on the other hand, he gives good gifts to people, regardless of their beliefs. As Jesus says in Matthew 5:45, "For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust." You see, because of God's common grace, which I distinguish from his saving grace, because of his common grace, scientists of all religions and beliefs are studying the handiwork of God, even if they do not acknowledge that's what they're doing. There is broad and practical agreement about the methods and the findings of science due to the common grace gift of reason and the consistency and the orderliness of God's creation. And Lewis is going to talk about that later on. The differences of worldview show up not here, but in the presuppositions of science. You see, for the Christian, the presuppositions needed for science flow directly from the biblical teaching about human nature and God's work in creation. In no sense, this is really important, in no sense at all does a Christian ever need to set aside their faith in order to do science. When you go to university, you don't have to hang up your Christian bag before you walk into the laboratory. The Christian does not need to adopt a theologically neutral position or posture when they enter the laboratory. Rather, scientific methods and human reasoning are fully Christian activities. You see, the Christian believes that humans have reliable senses and an ability to comprehend the natural world for biblical reasons. Humans are made in God's image and are gifted by God to name, to care for, and to work and to study his handiwork. The Christian believes that nature operates with universal, repeatable patterns because Scripture teaches that nature is not filled with unpredictable and capricious gods, but ruled by one God in a faithful, orderly, and consistent manner. And so it's because of God's faithfulness that physical processes like gravity and electricity and buoyancy and thermodynamics and so on behave consistently across all time in the entire universe with incredible mathematical precision. And on the other hand, if on the other hand, the world is just a product of chance, then why should it work in such an orderly way? And if our minds are just the product of chance, how shall we trust our minds when they tell us anything? You see, for the Christian, the beauty and consistency and symmetry of these laws is clearly an expression of the beauty and the faithfulness of our glorious Creator. And so as Christians, we do not need to fear that we are adopting atheistic methods when we are doing science, because we're not. It's the atheist who's adopting biblical principles, because the scientific method is ultimately built on biblical and Christian principles. Rather, what we can do is we can celebrate the positive influence that the biblical worldview has had in establishing the presuppositions and the methods of science that are now shared by all scientists. But we must not get complacent. Although the biblical worldview overlaps at certain points with an atheistic worldview in the methods and the findings of science because of God's common grace, we must not forget our radically different starting points. We must never concede to an atheistic framing of science. Sorry about that. I'm just going to send my PDF to my Apple book because it's easier on my eyesight to read it there. It's coming. It's almost there. There it is. Okay. That's good. Now I can just scan across. One of the main tools I'm going to argue, and I'm sure Lewis is going to disagree with me a bit, but I think we might find in the end that it might be a little bit more an issue of terminology maybe than actual substance. But in my view, one of the main tools for misappropriating science to serve the wrong master is called methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism is the idea that science can only give natural explanations for natural phenomena. Methodological naturalism is used to cut out any claims of God's direct actions or involvement in creation. As philosopher Stephen Dilly explains, scientific practice and discourse should not or cannot consider God's action as an explanation for natural phenomena. Instead, the only permissible explanations within science are the ones that appeal exclusively to natural entities, causes, processes, laws, and the like. Evolutionist Michael Ruse holds that science, by definition, deals only with the natural, the repeatable, that which is governed by law. One obvious implication of this definition, if allowed to stand, is that it admits atheistic metaphysical claims and blocks out Christian metaphysical or religious claims. Don't bring them into my laboratory. So when asked about God, they say, as did the French mathematician Laplace, "Sir, I have no need of that hypothesis. God is reduced to a hypothesis, and a very unnecessary one at that, since the world and life can now be explained through science without any reference to God." Methodological naturalism is part of the reason that Christianity is banished from the public sphere and banished to the private sphere. It is science, not scripture, that makes public truth claims. Claims that are universal as the law of gravity, or motion, or thermodynamics, or relativity. Methodological naturalism ensures that Christianity has no place in these claims. It ensures the truth that God made the world is never public truth. It is never a public truth claim, even though Scripture asserts in Romans chapter 1 that it is universally known. Methodological naturalism relegates Christianity to the world and the sphere of private, subjective beliefs, as the following diagram illustrates. So the question I want to ask you this afternoon is this: should we make methodological naturalism a philosophy of science? And my answer is a resounding no. And I believe that methodological naturalism should be rejected for the following 4 reasons. I could give more, but just for time, I'm going to give 4 main reasons. Number 1, we've already argued that in no sense does a Christian have to set aside their faith in order to do science. Nor does the Christian have to adopt a theologically neutral posture when they engage in scientific analysis or investigation. Rather, we've already pointed out that the scientific method and human reasoning are fully Christian activities that should be carried out in the presence of God, under the lordship of Jesus Christ, and for his glory. Number 2, moreover, we've argued that scientific analysis can only be properly carried out on the basis of theistic and not naturalistic presuppositions. We argue that God and God alone provides a basis for the order, the pattern, the consistency, the mathematical precision that may be discovered in the physical world. As C.S. Lewis pointed out in his book on miracles, he said men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Johannes Kepler, the German mathematician and astronomer, described his motivation in this way. He says, the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order which has been imposed on it by God and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. Such a discovery for Kepler, at least according to legend or tradition, amounted to thinking God's thoughts after him. For Kepler, saying God did it was not a science stopper, as Richard Dawkins claims it is. It is actually a science starter, and indeed it was the science starter. You see, because the scientific method is not built on the presuppositions or assumptions of methodological naturalism. But I'd like to suggest to you another term that we could use in-house, that it's built on the assumptions of methodological theism. Number 3, defining science or the scientific method in terms of methodological naturalism commits scientists to an unjustified and, in my view, a completely false view of biological origins. Methodological naturalism means that science has no mechanism to detect a supernatural cause. It does not consider the likelihood that a phenomenon might not be purely naturalistic, that there might be a supernatural explanation for it. And so if it came across something that God did, like let's say, for example, the very first living cell, scientists would continue to search for only naturalistic explanations. Methodological naturalism would say, we can discover the origin of this by doing more research according to our existing paradigm of historical evolution. It cannot, and they would say it must not, consider the possibility that there is no naturalistic explanation for the origin of life. There must be a naturalistic explanation. Moreover, it recognizes design in nature only when the designer is nature itself. In theory, biological origins has problems, and it has many. And we're going to see one of those in a moment. And the problems, however, are always viewed by scientists as research problems. Let's do a bit more research and we'll find an answer. When in actual fact, they are actually paradigm problems, worldview problems. However, methodological naturalism means that there is no criteria, no set of rules by which we may distinguish what is a research problem and what is a paradigm problem. It therefore cannot recognize that this is a problem that actually calls into question the adequacy of the naturalistic paradigm within which it's working. Methodological naturalism binds science to the paradigm problems of historical evolution. This is because it restricts the goal of science to providing purely naturalistic explanations in answer to the question of the origins of the universe or the origins of life. As a theologian and scientist, he studied biology initially, Alistair McGrath explains, he says the natural sciences are characterized by their empirical stance and a principal refusal to accept predetermined theories or accounts of our world laid down by scientists, philosophers, or theologians. Fourthly, defining the scientific method in terms of methodological naturalism is absolutely detrimental to the discipline of historical science. As Stephen Meyer points out in his book, Signature in the Cell, allowing methodological naturalism to function as an absolute ground rule of method for all science would have a deleterious effect on the practice of certain scientific disciplines, especially the historical sciences. Philosopher Alvin Plantinga, another one who recognizes the stifling effect of methodological naturalism, says this. He writes, methodological naturalism, though widely accepted and indeed exalted, has little to be said for it. In some circumstances, it is quite clearly inapplicable. As Stephen Meyer goes on to explain, in origin of life research, for example, methodological naturalism artificially restricts inquiry and prevents scientists from exploring and examining some hypothesis that might provide the most likely, best, or causally adequate explanations. So, for example, the work of God as creator. Historical science differs from experimental science in some important ways. And I've got to put a chart up there. Experimental science is built on direct observations of cause and effect. Historical science lacks direct observation of the cause. We have the effect only. Secondly, experimental science searches for laws which eliminate contingencies as explanations. In historical science, contingencies are often used as explanations to make sure that the explanation fits the paradigm. In experimental science, repeatability is required. In historical science, repeatability is not even possible in most cases. Experimental science is more certain than historical science. Historical science is less certain than experimental science. In experimental science, we are focused on secondary causes, natural laws, for example. Whereas in historical science, we're focused both on secondary but also primary causes, particularly when we're thinking about the issue of the origin of the universe or the origin of biological life. In experimental science, personal agency is not an acceptable explanation. But in historical science, personal agency can be an acceptable explanation. Experimental science tends towards empiricism. Historical science tends towards rationalism. So, to make this a bit more concrete, I want you to think about the case of two researchers. They're both scientists, but they do very different work. Scientist number one is trying to find a cure for cancer, or a certain type of cancer. Scientist number two is trying to figure out how amphibians evolved from fish, or birds evolved from dinosaurs. Now, these two different types of work make for two quite different types of science. Go to our first scientist. The first scientist performs laboratory experiments to learn more about cancer cells and how to treat them. This scientist follows the scientific method as set out in my biology textbook used at the University of Melbourne, which two of my children have used. One of them's here. Hello. This method involves developing a hypothesis. Secondly, conducting an experiment to test the hypothesis. Thirdly, determining if the result can be repeated in future experiments. And then fourthly, if it can, we can develop a theory. And we'll go on to test that theory. All of this, of course, depends upon the ability of the scientist to actually witness the phenomenon in question. Let's go to our second scientist who's trying to work out how dinosaurs evolved into birds. The second scientist investigates clues in order to determine what events might have occurred in the past. So she or he lacks the ability to witness these events directly and to conduct experiments on them. The fundamental difference here is that we cannot actually observe, test, or repeat past events. Instead, clues are examined and a story is created that seems to plausibly explain the clues that we have in front of us. Wonder how it got here. Now, the most obvious and well-known conflict between Christianity and science is in the historical sciences, not experimental science. If you listen to later on to the questions that Lewis is going to ask in his talk, they're going to be issues of historical science, and we'll talk about that then. It's the dispute about evolution and the age of the earth and the origin of biological life. The dispute is in that area because that dispute is not ultimately about science. It's about history. Science gets tangled up into it because it's used to support certain historical claims. And these claims end up in our science textbooks. I'm going to give an example of that in the textbook used by Melbourne University in a moment. You see, because of the fantastic success that scientists have enjoyed in explaining phenomena in the laboratory, we assume that they must therefore be correct when they explain natural history. And people think that because the claims are being made by scientists, well, they must be scientific. Ernest Mayr, an evolutionary biologist and one of the leading philosophers of biology in the last century, writes this. He says, evolutionary biology, in contrast with physics and chemistry, is a historical science. The evolutionist attempts to explain events and processes that have already taken place. Laws and experiments are inappropriate techniques for the explication of such events and processes. Instead, one constructs a historical narrative consisting of a tentative reconstruction of the particular scenario that led to the events that one is trying to explain. This is not the method of experimental science. Rather, it is the method of inference to the best explanation. What best explains what I'm seeing here? With such unrepeatable events, such as the origin of the universe or the origin of biological life, one has to ask, what is the best explanation of this event or phenomena? Consider for a moment the following little snippet from an interview on American television, PBS, with Richard Dawkins, the world's most vigorous advocate of evolution. He's going to be here in Melbourne very soon. Dawkins says, look, evolution has been observed. It's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. Okay, Richard. Well, what do you mean, says the interviewer? What do you mean it's been observed? Well, what I mean is the consequences of it. It's rather like a detective coming on a murder after the scene, and you, the detective, haven't actually seen the murder take place, of course, but what you see is a massive clue. Now, any detective... So, Richard, you're talking about circumstantial evidence. Well, yes, circumstantial evidence, but masses of circumstantial evidence. Huge quantities of circumstantial evidence. It might as well be spelled out in words of English. Evolution is true. I mean, it's as circumstantial as that, but it's as true as that. Of course, what we don't have is circumstantial evidence. We have evidence that we're trying to explain. And what Richard Dawkins is really saying, we have lots of coherent explanation for it, logical, rational, empirical explanation for it. So notice that Dawkins is not talking about a scientific definition of evolution here. He does not mean new species coming from natural selection and random mutations. That sort of evolution, that sort of change has been observed in the laboratory. It's called natural selection. Everyone agrees on that. Evolutionists, creationists, young Earth, old Earth. Dawkins is talking about historical evolution. He's talking about evolution as the story of life. He's talking about the claim that this little part of observed biology, natural selection, new species arising from random mutations, is able to explain the whole of biology. And that's where the disagreement is. Notice that even Dawkins has conceded the case. These claims, and noting that this type of science is not supported by direct observations of what is happening. That's something you'll notice that's common throughout the debate. You'll find there is no disagreement about the observations. I'm going to give you a good example of that in just a moment. There is no disagreements over the observed science. The disagreements are over the worldview interpretations. It's never about the measurements, it's always about the models. It's never about the evidence, it's always about the extrapolations. It's never about the science, it's always about the story. And so to close, and to give you an illustration of this in closing, I'm going to turn to my biology textbook that's used for first-year biology students at Melbourne University. So I'm not going to quote creationist material. I'm going to look at the standard biological textbook at Melbourne Uni. And we're going to turn to chapter 34, which is titled Mechanisms of Evolution. Excited, aren't we? We're going to find out what the mechanism of evolution is. And the answer it gives is mutation and natural selection as the mechanisms for evolution. But then it just assumes that these are sufficient to explain all of biological life. Let's start with their definition of evolution, which I'm going to disagree with in a moment, and you'll see why. According to our textbook, evolution, this is what evolution is. Biological evolution is change over time in the genetic composition of populations. That's the definition they're going to unpack in their textbook. So now, all genetic change over time is evolution. This extrapolation simply assumes that it's due to evolution. There is no acknowledgement of any of the limits of evolution. So, for example, when we ask this question of our textbook, what is the mechanism for creating new genetic information? Genetic instructions, genetic specifications for proteins, for example. What is the mechanism for creating new genetic information leading to all of the biological diversity we see in this room and on this planet? How does our textbook answer? Well, the answer is mutations. And so under the heading, the components of evolution, we are told this on page 858. Genetic diversity is generated slowly by mutation. You can buy the textbook anywhere, ebook, hard copy, and read it for yourself. I was going to bring it, but it's so heavy. Now, according to our textbook, the mechanism for creating all the new information needed to transform a relatively simple microbe into a complex human being is mutations. But here's my question of the textbook. How much genetic information is needed, or how much new information do mutations need to create in order to transform a relatively simple microbe into a microbiologist, for example? Well, Don Batten, who has a PhD in plant physiology, answers, and you can find this information anywhere on the internet too. He says the essential, the basic, the most simple microbe's genome is about 500,000 nucleotides. That's letters. A human has some 3 billion. So to change the former into the latter, mutations have to invent nearly 3 billion nucleotides, letters, of information or specifications. But you see, the trouble here is mutations don't create any new information at all on their own. We have evidence that mutations can change the genetic sequence, can destroy genetic information, but there is no scientific evidence in the laboratory that they can create new, complex genetic information. And guess what? Our university textbook admits it. Having just told us that genetic diversity is generated slowly by mutation, they go on to say this. Under the heading mutation, we read this. Page 839. Mutations do not arise to fill a function, nor do they reflect the intentions of individuals. In fact, most mutations that occur reduce the fitness of individuals. For example, researchers have looked at how commonly mutations increase fitness versus those that decrease it. In these experiments, most mutations, known as lethal mutations, kill the organism, and only a small fraction of them are considered advantageous mutations. Many other mutations are slightly deleterious, harmful. Although they do not kill the organism, they moderately reduce fitness. Is this a good mechanism to create all the biological diversity we see around us from a simple microbe whose origin we're not even sure about? Don Batten rightly concludes, and this book's available on the sales table. I'm going to show some in a moment. Mutations of one form or another are the only mechanism evolutionists have to explain the almost incomprehensible quantities of genetic information in the biosphere. Change over time? Yes. Changes that cause microbes to become microbiologists? No. It does not add up. Mutations are clearly, by our textbook's own admission, are clearly an inadequate mechanism for creating all of the biological diversity we see around us. Complex biological diversity that supposedly arose from one relatively simple common ancestor that we still cannot explain. Yet evolutionists persist in teaching this. That is, they promote the idea that big change, evolution, equals small change, mutation, natural selection, over billions of years. This is a logical fallacy. I hope you worked it out. It's often referred to as the politician's fallacy. It comes from the television sitcom Yes, Minister. And it goes like this. Mutation causes change over time. Evolution is change over time. Therefore, mutation is evolution. That's the logic of the textbook. But this is like saying all cats have 4 legs, all dogs have 4 legs, therefore my cat is a dog. But some teachers use logic like this to disarm students who might resist accepting the story of evolution by saying things like, evolution means change. Here's an example of change, mutation or natural selection. Therefore, evolution is a fact. But as we've seen, they're not the same thing. As we've seen, our textbook is absolutely wrong about their definition of evolution. Evolution does not just involve change over time. It also entails the creation of radically new and complex information over time. If you want to go from a microbe that has 500,000 nucleotides to a human that has 3 billion, it's not just about change. It's about the addition of radically new complex information. And what's more, if you want to include God in the process, as theistic evolution tries to do, you've just handed God a completely ineffective tool, making him look very incompetent indeed. Because God's tool does not work. So, to conclude then, what should you do when you find your science textbook contradicting the scriptures and even contradicting basic logic? Well, because the historical claims are not limited to claims of evolutionary history, but also the age of the earth, you need to do a number of things. Number one, you should not be surprised. If all the world is in rebellion against God and affected by the fall, then you should not expect science to be exempt, because scientists are fallen people. Number two, you're obliged to understand what is in your curriculum. You don't have to agree with it, but you do need to understand it, and you should not be afraid of it, because you cannot criticize it unless you've understood it carefully. We need to listen to one another, don't we? Hear what we're saying and engage in humble, warm, winsome dialogue. Thirdly, if you're not sure what to make of it, one of the places I often go to is creation.com, which contains over 15,000 articles related to creation and evolution. And then finally, I want to recommend a couple of books that are out there on the table that I really like. books like Jonathan Sarfady's The Genesis Account, PhD in chemistry from University of Victoria in Wellington, New Zealand, a wonderful book that combines theological, exegetical, philosophical, and scientific analysis. One of the first places I go to is the Creation Answers book that answers 60 of our most asked questions. Really useful book, short little chapters. For a slightly more technical but very useful book, Evolution's Achilles' Heels. PhD scientists explain evolution's fatal flaws and areas claimed to be its greatest strength. For a slightly more high school level, Jonathan Sarfady's Refuting Evolution. And then theologically, if you want to dig into what I've been saying a bit more, I've created about 100-minute DVD with 7 talks on it, the gospel implications of creation. So there's a lot of wonderful resources I encourage you to make the most of. Thank you very much. I'll hand it over there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. Such a thought-provoking, insightful sharing. So if anyone have any questions for Martin, so please text your questions to the number on the screen. And now it's time that I'd like to pass the floor to Louis. Louis is who holds a PhD in astrophysics, who is also a theologian. So he's going to walk us through science and Christianity. Thank you.
It's excellent. You often get promoted when you get introduced at lectures and things. That's quite all right. Oh no. Whoa. Okay. Excellent. Well, thanks. And this talk is largely going. I'll just kind of. Oh, look at that. So I've kind of put these 2 cheeky questions up there. Does God believe in science? Does science believe in God? We're kind of going to just, traipse around those questions, enjoy ourselves a little bit. What you're going to find is that I'm going to give a little bit more detail, perhaps on some points where Martin's already highlighted basically like the theistic background of science. We'll probably get to a point of disagreement about some of the issues related to methodological naturalism. But ultimately, I've got 2 big ideas. All right, so the 2 big ideas that I want to get through now are the relationship between the success of science and the Christian doctrine of creation, okay? So that the relationship between those 2 things, success of science and the Christian doctrine of creation. And then also the nature and navigation of conflicts between science and Christianity. So in a sense, just hopefully some tips to help us think how you deal with these conflicts when they arise. Okay, so that's the big picture of what I'd like to do. But you'll recognize most of the first half of this as very similar to things that Martin has just told us, maybe a little bit more detail, different people with different quotes. How's that? Okay, well, look, science is cool, and we've already seen some of those things. Astronomy, of course, is especially cool. And one of the things about science is that thankfully, it is actually for everyone. That is, if you look at the people who are engaged in science research around the world, you'll find people of all ethnicities and religions and worldviews, and even Christians. Indeed, research, that's where we're headed. Research.com recently compiled a list of the top 51,000 physicists in the world by their research impact ranking. You don't need to be able to read anything on the slide. And the top 3 of the top 6 physics researchers in Australia are churchgoers. And I know this because I know them. And all of those 3 are in the top 400 researchers worldwide. One of them I know well to be a Bible-believing evangelical Christian who also happens to be the grandfather of one of my daughter's good friends at school. But look, there are thousands of less well-known Christians all around Australia working away at lives in science. And just as Martin has said, this is a Christian pursuit. So if Christians are happy to be working in science, shouldn't it be surprising when we hear someone like Richard Dawkins, and we've met Richard already, when we hear him say something like this: "As a scientist, I am hostile to fundamentalist religion because it actively debauches the scientific enterprise. It teaches us not to change our minds and not to want to know exciting things that are available to be known. It subverts science and saps the intellect." And now, just in case you were tempted to think he's not talking about you, when he says fundamentalist, he means anyone who believes in the bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead. So no, sadly, it's not surprising when we hear these things, is it? Because we're all familiar with this kind of comment at family dinners, around the tea table at work, in our tutorials at university. Christianity is based on faith, science is based on facts. Science has proven the Bible isn't true, we know miracles don't happen, evolution has demonstrated there's no cosmic designer, I can't be a Christian because I believe in evolution. But why? Why are these attitudes so common? And it comes down to the question of how we know the things we know. That's the kind of broad field of epistemology. But there's a broad cultural belief that science and Christianity function as competing explanations for the same set of questions, but that science has better explanations. Right? And this belief that science is the best way to know stuff is called scientism. And scientism is conviction that scientific knowledge, particularly that derived from natural sciences, is the highest or even only form of knowledge. And to give a flavor of people who talk that way in books rather than on the street, because you hear it a lot on the street as well, the proverbial person on the street. But Paul Davies is a cosmologist who is a popularizer of science as well, and he says things like this: science has actually advanced to the point where what were formerly religious questions can be seriously tackled. Okay, see, that's scientism. Or science offers a surer path to God than religion. So the scientific enterprise is so good at answering the questions we've asked about the physical world that we have persuaded ourselves that science will answer all questions that can possibly be asked on any subject, including the metaphysical questions of meaning and purpose, for example. And on top of this, science won't just be answering our metaphysical questions. Science is now the only means by which we will answer any of those questions that is a surer path to God. Now, one of the primary factors responsible for the rise of this kind of scientistic attitude is the success of science. Science has been successful in explaining the workings of the physical world, and as Martin has pointed out, largely without reference to God in the process. Right? And so the success of science is related to both the nature of science as an enterprise, but also the nature of the world it investigates. And so what I want to do now is look more closely at the nature of science and the nature of the world in order to try to understand how we've arrived at this point where we are of scientism as our sort of default foundational Western worldview. It's a sub-worldview of how we know what we know. Okay, so consider this graph here. You don't have to, trust me, I think you lose half your audience every time you put a graph up on the screen or something like that. Anyway, don't worry, you don't really need to know anything about this graph, okay? But this is a graph of altitude versus boiling point. What does it, let me just let you reflect a little bit yourselves. What does it tell you about the nature of the world in which we live? Well, as more and more people took up the challenge to discover the laws of nature, they found that there was no end to these kinds of very regular relationships between different physical quantities. Indeed, they expected to find them. In fact, had they not expected to find them, what would have been the point in the process in the first place? This brings us to what we might call the assumptions or presuppositions of science. So as I said, Martin's already outlined some of these. I want to add a couple, and I want to just give you a little bit more detail about them. The presuppositions of science are those ideas about the nature of our world, such that if they were not true, the empirical project of modern science would simply cease to be. They are presuppositions because they're ideas that we presuppose without being able to demonstrate their truth. We assume they're correct about the world and then kind of go about our lives as if they are. So our graph here, I think, gives us at least three things that seem to be true about our world, which again, were they not true, science as we know it would basically cease to exist. And so the first one of those is that creation must be orderly, right? That there are regularities, patterns, and structures in creation to be discovered. And the second one is that creation is intelligible to our human minds. And Martin certainly highlighted that point as well. And thirdly is that creation operates with on a physical chain of cause and effect. Largely. Even though we cannot demonstrate that our presuppositions about the world are true, or how the world must of necessity be, it remains that if they are not true, then, and we did not believe them to be true, no one could have or would have bothered with what we now call science. But it's in the truth of these presuppositions where we discover the power of science and the reason for its success over the last 400 years or so, since kind of the rationalist empiricist debates of the turn of the 17th century and the victory really of the empirical methodology of science. Let's spend a little bit of time looking at these presuppositions, and then and just kind of get familiar with them, and then I'll take another look back at them again. In more detail. But first of all, so orderliness, right? So nature is orderly. This seems an obvious assertion to us. We live in a world that's orderly. Our graph, demonstrates this quite nicely. There are patterns and structures to be discovered. And we run experiments, one day and get a result, and we run the same experiment the next day and we get the same result, right? The idea of repeatability of experiment leading to our reliability of knowledge, right? That comes from the orderliness of creation. 98%, of the work done in our research labs is based on this idea that the reliability of knowledge comes from our ability to repeat experiments. We can collect meaningful data in that way. Okay, so the next one is intelligibility. Nature is intelligible. One of the key points to pick up here is actually about the mathematical nature of the world in which we live. What do I mean by that? Well, take our graph again. As an example, I can draw a line through those points, a line that will have a simple mathematical formula that describes the shape of that line. I can then pick an altitude on that graph for which I do not have any data. I can plug into my formula the number and discover the boiling point of water at an altitude without ever going there and running the experiment. Now that may sound magic or something, or Greek or whatever to you, but rest assured it is one of the most fascinating things about the world in which we live. You may or may not agree with me about how fascinating it is, but whether or not you agree, the mathematical nature of the world is essential for the success of science. It allows us to predict the future. I don't know if you've thought about it that way, but that is the glory of science. You tell me you're going to go up to the top of Mount Everest and measure the boiling point of water, and I can predict the result you will get before you ever go. I can predict the future. But without the correspondence of mathematics to the physical world, that would be impossible. Richard Feynman, who is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist from the middle of the 20th century, he describes the power of predictions like this. He says it has to be done because the extrapolations are the only things that have any real value. It is only the principle of what you think will happen in a case you have not tried that is worth knowing about. Knowledge is of no real value if all you can tell me is what happened yesterday. It is necessary to tell what will happen tomorrow if you do something. Not only necessary, but fun. Indeed, it is fun. And so there's the intelligibility of our world. And the third one is this idea of physical cause and effect. That is, this presupposition is that any phenomena we observe will have a physical cause. Really? I mean, now, Christians, of course, don't believe that, do we? But let me look a little bit more into this before we make too much of a judgment. So Newton sits under the tree and observes the apple falling to the ground. Now, Newton could have responded by thinking, and Martin's talked this through for us already, he could have responded by saying, God did it, right? And if the Christians are right, well, God did do it, of course. And Newton was entirely justified in his conclusion. Job well done, mystery solved. But at the same time, you can see where this is going, right? Newton could say the same thing for anything he observes in the world and be perfectly correct and yet learn absolutely nothing about the physical working of the world in which we live, the physical mechanisms or the chains of cause and effect that led to the apple falling from the tree. Yes, God did it. And outside of God's providential care for his creation, it would not have happened. It seems, however, that we can generally also discover physical causes for events we observe. And so one of the presuppositions of science is that we will be able to discover those physical causes for observed phenomena. Now, this presupposition is methodological naturalism. It's not a belief that there are no supernatural causes, right? That's philosophical naturalism. But simply the assumption that nature is organized in such a way that we will most likely be able to find a physical cause for the phenomena that we observe. Now, without that assumption, we'd probably just hang up our boots in the first place. Under methodological naturalism, scientists have effectively agreed not to appeal to or reason from God or principles derived from the nature of God to explain what we deserve, but continue to search for physical causes in creation itself. That's the way this presupposition works within science. Now, you know, you might go through several lives of PhD students before you find an answer. You may never find an answer. But the idea of methodological naturalism is that, well, you just keep looking in, and as Martin's highlighted. Now, Christians, of course, for science, then, you have unanswered questions rather than invoking this kind of supernatural explanation to resolve the tension. Christians, of course, can think of plenty of phenomena that will consistently defy physical explanation, the chief of which, of course, is the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. But that doesn't mean we give up on methodological naturalism as a general rule for uncovering the physical workings of the world. Methodological naturalism necessarily does constrain our explanations, but it is also at the same time one of the primary driving forces behind scientific advancements. It cuts off the kind of easy out from curly problems. And humans don't like unanswered questions. The way Francis Bacon, our kind of original empiricist from the 17th century, says it like this: they are ill discoverers who think there is no land when they can see nothing but sea. Methodological naturalism says, don't give up. Even when you've been out on the ocean for months, if you want to be a good scientist, you keep sailing. That's how this whole game got started, as it were. Well, nature is orderly and intelligible, seemingly explicable, largely without reference to God, at least, you know, on your average day in the lab, no one rising from the dead, etc. But now consider the moment, for a moment, the weight of that reality, right, brought to bear for 400 years on the minds of people who live with and by and for the advances of science, the myriad practical blessings that science has bestowed upon them. Steam trains, automobiles, telephones, computers, medicine, all of these have been brought to you by our advances in scientific knowledge. We've had 400 years of breaking through every unbreakable barrier, and all without mentioning God. So far, we've been able to find and follow the physical chain of cause and effect to get the answers we're looking for, largely. Now, this isn't to say there aren't unanswered questions, but the past 400 years has shown that even long-standing problems find an answer eventually. The problem is in the logic that has been applied to this reality. And the logic has gone something like this. Science is the most successful endeavor of the past 400 years. Science has answered nearly every question about the physical world that's been thrown at it. God has not been mentioned or needed to answer any of those questions, and therefore God probably never existed in the first place. The success of science has wooed us into naturalism and thereby into scientism. And that is, our society has been convinced that if all that exists is the physical world and science is the best way to answer questions about the physical world, then all questions worth asking and answering will be answered by science. There are virtually no rivals for runs on the board in the generation of knowledge about our world. When society wants answers, it turns to science. And so confident are we that science is the only game in town, Richard Dawkins can end his children's book, The Magic of Reality, with the following paragraph. So where does life come from? What is it? I think I've got a slide. Why are we here? What are we for? What's the meaning of life? There's a conventional wisdom which says that science has nothing to say about such questions. Well, all I can say is that if science has nothing to say, it's certain that no other discipline can say anything at all. That is scientism. And that is where we are today, and that's a little bit of how we got there. Our cultural adoption of scientism has been partly driven by the idea that the success of science has been independent of God. But what I want to do now is circle back on those presuppositions and look at whether a Christian or naturalistic worldview, or doctrine of creation in a sense, provides more warrant for or underpinning of those presuppositions, and hence the success of science. So which of these worldviews is more amenable to those presuppositions and the success of science? Martin's already, I was going to detour past the, through this idea of the Christian attitude towards science, but I think Martin's already done that very nicely. Of course, science is a Christian endeavor. It's what we were made to do, in a sense. We were made to rule over this creation. How are we going to do that without understanding how this world works, frankly? And so science is always going to be part of the way that we conducted business as Christians in this world. And that's just, again, our look at Genesis 1 there. Okay, but let's get on to the biblical view of creation and the success of science, okay? So the success of the empirical scientific enterprise is related to the presuppositions that it held about the world. And so this is our graph again, okay? Because those presuppositions turned out to be true, the endeavor founded upon those presuppositions was bound for success from the beginning. So now I want to look at those three presuppositions and ask the question from naturalism and from Christianity, which gives the most support for those presuppositions. And okay, you've already guessed the answer, right? But let's take a look, because I think it is interesting and hopefully encouraging to you as you navigate this world of scientism outside these doors here. So first of all, the orderliness of nature. Richard Feynman, and I didn't say before, he is an atheist. He gives us the view from naturalism. He says this idea about orderliness. Incidentally, the fact that there are rules at all to be checked is a kind of miracle. That it is possible to find a rule like the inverse square law of gravitation is some sort of miracle. He says, from the perspective of naturalism, the fact that there are regularities and patterns in creation is just, ironically, a miracle, right? There's no reason from within naturalism to suppose orderliness, because nature is an accident, right? It's an accidental arrangement of matter from a naturalistic point of view. There's no goal, no purpose, or intentionality behind it. But of course, from Genesis 1, we get a completely different picture, right? That, there's the land produces vegetation, that there's an orderliness there. The seeds produce similar vegetation to where the seeds came from. There are lights in the sky that govern the times and days and years and stuff. There's order to creation, right? In fact, the entire creation account, right, in creation week is an orderly account around those 7 days. Christians are encouraged to expect the orderliness of creation from just chapter 1 of Genesis. Okay, the intelligibility, poor Richard Feynman, he's back on there again. The intelligibility of nature. Feynman says this: the rules that describe nature seem to be mathematical. It is not a characteristic necessity of science that it be mathematical. It just turns out that you can state mathematical laws in physics at least, which work to make powerful predictions. So he says, there's no reason why this should be the case. It just is the case. Okay? And so there is no reason, again, within naturalism to think that mathematics should correspond to our world in such a way that it allows us to make these kind of powerful predictions that mean we can harness and fashion our world. Einstein says the same thing. He says, trying to grasp the success of science in understanding the world, he says the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. Again, there is no reason to think that our minds should correspond this well to the creation. But on the other hand, of course, back to our same old, our tired Genesis 1, verse 26. And Martin's actually highlighted this very verse on this very point. Is that the whole purpose of humanity is to be stewards of this creation. Of course, God is going to it makes perfect sense. God makes us to be able to understand creation. The rational God who makes a rational creation creates rational beings who can understand it and comprehend it. He makes us fit for purpose. And again, so we can see that naturalism offers no reason to expect nature to be intelligible, whereas Christianity, on the basis of just Genesis 1, provides a firm grounding for that second presupposition. And then thirdly, our methodological naturalism, this idea that all phenomena have natural causes. Now, obviously, naturalism, sort of by definition, shines on this point, because the only kind of cause available within naturalism is a natural cause. But while this presupposition, in a sense, has good naturalistic support, there remains, however, one chink in the armor, and it's fundamental. And that is, if all phenomena are meant to have natural causes, then there remains one enormous, whacking, great phenomena that still requires explanation. The universe, right? The universe itself. And gravitational theorist and atheist John Wheeler makes this comment. He says, science must provide a mechanism for the universe to come into being. I mean, it's a nonsensical statement because science is contained within the universe. Science doesn't somehow exist outside of the universe. It's complete nonsense. Brilliant gravitational theorist, complete nonsense. But you see his point, right? If science can't provide a mechanism for the universe to come into being, then this methodological naturalism isn't going to work because there is some kind of metaphysical, supernatural cause lurking out there that we don't know about, that we don't want to admit to. Paul Davies understands the same challenge. The cosmological argument is the argument that, in a sense, saying that there is something rather than nothing, therefore there must have been a creator. That's kind of the hack version of the cosmological argument. And Davies says this: the so-called cosmological argument has in one form or another often been used as evidence for the existence of God. The enigma of the cosmic origin is probably the one area where the atheistic scientist will feel uncomfortable. Davies goes on to say that the cosmological argument would be hard to fault unless science, again, the Wheeler problem, can explain the origin of the cosmos from within the framework of physics. Again, a nonsensical statement. This is a genuine problem for naturalism. That is, if the universe has a beginning, but the cause is metaphysical rather than physical, then naturalism simply fails because there would, in fact, be some kind of supernatural cause at work. But methodological naturalism is never more than a working assumption and can maintain its usefulness in the face of an occasional exception, like this. Naturalism itself becomes immediately untenable in the case of any kind of supernatural intrusion. Now, for Christianity, on the other hand, methodological naturalism was only ever a tool to encourage empirical investigation. The idea was actually created by Christians to advance science. And it was never a commitment to the idea that, that there was an absence of supernatural realities. Now, okay, even then, it may seem surprising to a certain degree that, given they were Christians, that the empiricists adopted methodological naturalism as one of their working assumptions. But it turns out that the idea was derived from a very basic tenet of Christian doctrine, the Christian doctrine of creation, and in fact, the very first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Christianity understands God to be distinct from his creation. Creation is outside of God, separate from God. Creation is not part of God. It is not God. If you imagine the water bottle here, so here's the universe in the water bottle, and my hand is God, okay? The water bottle is completely dependent on God for its life and purpose, as it were, its position in the world. But if you lived inside the water bottle universe, right, then you could live there happily without any knowledge about the hand outside the bottle. You could live in there and investigate the workings of the water bottle world without any reference to the hand outside the water bottle. And so that's the reason that methodological naturalism works in large part. That's the reason that even Christians were suggesting this as one of the sort of methodologies of science, is because the assumption was that you should be able to find physical causes for physical phenomena in this world that God made. There was a time when there was only God, and then there was without creation, and then there was creation. They are distinct things. They're not part of one another. And so because of that, the Christians were happy to suggest this as one of the methodologies of science. There are problems with it. And in fact, as Martin has pointed out, it has led, because of the success of science, it has now led to this worldview that we find ourselves in, where we haven't referenced God, and everyone now thinks that we don't need God. And so it is a problem. And yet, it has also been very useful and has given us so many amazing things like clickers for projectors and whatever. Well, okay, so these three presuppositions of science find a happier home in Christianity than they do in naturalism. And that also has consequences for the rise of science. And so Rodney Stark, a historian and sociologist, says it like this. He says, leading historians and sociologists of science agree that science was a development unique to Europe. And so historians agree then that modern science arose in Christendom, in this Christian Europe. But the question is why? Why did it arise there? And Stark says this: my answer to this question is as brief as it is unoriginal. Christianity depicted God as a rational, responsive, dependable, and omnipotent being, and the universe as his personal creation, thus having a rational, lawful, stable structure awaiting human comprehension. So Stark holds that the nature of the God of Christianity and the consequent nature of his creation were the inevitable seedbed for the rise of modern science. Peter Harrison, Australian, up at the University of Queensland, professor of the history of the relationship between science and Christianity, says it like this: could modern science have arisen out of the theological matrix of Western Christendom? It is difficult to say. What can be said for certain is that it did arise in that environment and that theological ideas underpinned some of its central assumptions. Those who argue for the incompatibility of science and religion will draw little comfort from history. So the success of science in explaining our world without reference to God has led to the logical misstep of imagining that God was never necessary or even there in the first place. And as science has become equated with naturalism, giving birth to scientism, the idea that science and Christianity could be anything but enemies has become implausible to the public. But what have we seen? First of all, that humans were made for science, as it were, and Christians should have an open and positive attitude toward doing science, but also what science discovers about the world. But also that the success of science is fundamentally built on presuppositions about the nature of our creation that are actually the Christian doctrine of creation. So now, at that point, it all sounds very nice and pleasant, and everyone's getting along nicely. But the fact is, there are still conflicts. We still experience conflicts. And so let me just take a few minutes and outline my sort of, wisdom for navigating these conflicts between science and Christianity. So we still have disagreements at Bible study, right, over certain passages of the Bible. We still don't know what to say when the evening news, just in the last week or so, shows us a skeleton of a man meant to have lived 31,000 years ago. Is the universe 13.8 billion years old or 6,000 years old? Was the first of our human species born as much as 2,000 years ago? Was that human being the result of gradual evolution over billions of years? Do human beings share a common ancestor with apes and rosellas and gum trees, etc.? Right? What happens after we die? Did Jesus walk on water? Did he rise from the dead? How do we approach these questions? All right, so first, I want to make sure we understand the nature of conflicts, okay? What is the nature of conflicts that we experience? And then I have what you could describe as a creation week's worth of tips to keep in mind as you navigate some of the tricky things in the relationship between science and the Bible. All right, so first of all, here's my anatomy of a conflict, okay? So you've got God here, and we've got God makes creation. God also writes the Bible. All right, so we got those two things there. Now we know that there is no conflict between those two things, right? They are objectively true, real, both of them. God is a unity. God is not equivocal in anything he does or makes or says. And so the Bible, whatever the Bible says about us and the world and God, is going to line up perfectly with whatever we learn from creation as well. Okay, we know that as a fundamental truth of Christian thinking, right? Okay, so then we've got science, and we can say that science is our attempt to understand creation, okay? And you could say, this is a little bit, the terminology, I'd had to pick something. Take theology, and this is our attempts to understand the Bible, okay? Now, but what the reality of that is that these are interpretations, right? We are humans, we are doing the best we can, but what we're doing is interpreting. Science is an interpretation of creation. Theology is an interpretation of the Bible, okay? Now, and so at the top, above the line, we've got the objective reality. We know there is no conflict. But below the line is our subjective reality, okay? Where we are constrained by simply our physical finitude. We are not infinite. We don't know everything. We are also broken, sinful, in rebellion against God, and we've been cut off from all sorts of sources of knowledge that we would have otherwise. And so we are finite and we are broken. And so when we try to interpret creation and interpret the Bible, we end up with potential conflicts, not between those objective realities that we know are true. We know there's no conflict. We know that. Right? And yet we sit here in this world and we can talk about conflicts all day long because they seem to crop up all the time. Why? Well, that's because it's in the subjective world that we experience those conflicts, right? It's our interpretations of things that create the conflicts and our imperfections and our constraints just from our created constraints. And so, as Martin highlighted, I think more toward the beginning of his talk just now, that worldview matters. And you can see here why it matters so much. It matters because the worldview is going to determine the nature of these conflicts. What you think about one thing will, how you interpret the Bible and creation will affect the you find yourself in. All right, well, I'll attempt to not explain these, my navigating of conflicts ideas. There's all four of them right there. The first one is be clear on what's essential. Okay, we have all sorts of things in our minds that we kind of hold dear for a variety of reasons, but when it comes to theology, we want to make sure that when we're navigating conflicts, we've decided what the essentials are. And I think Martin has done a really helpful job today in highlighting the gospel essentials that we need to hold on to when we're navigating conflicts. I mean, you could add other ones in there. But we need to be clear on the essentials. I think it makes us more comfortable when we discuss differences with other people to be certain where we stand ourselves. But be clear on the essentials. But be humble. That was, wow, yeah. Nice picture. But the other one is be humble. Because this is a subjective project that we're engaged in, because we are finite, we don't know everything, because we are broken, these conflicts arise, for bad reasons, and we just need to be humble in our discussions with people about conflicts. We just need to be ready to listen, right, more than we speak. We need to be ready to explore new ideas and make sure we understand where the other person is coming from. But humility is absolutely essential. Be driven by the truth. Christians cannot be censorship people. As a rule, if the truth is going to set us free, then we need to know if we have the truth. So censorship keeps us from ever being certain we've heard all the arguments against what we believe. But if we're wrong, don't we want to know? So let's be driven by the truth. And then look for layers of explanation. Where conflicts are concerned, one thing to remember is that there are always layers of explanation. Right? I mean, what if we've been hardwired by evolution to believe in God? Is that evidence against the existence of God? Well, no, it isn't. Both things can simply be true. They don't have to be competing explanations for why I believe in God. I can simply believe in God because he actually exists. So look for layers of explanation. So here's now where we get to my fantastic photograph of my wife. So why am I wearing a tie? Am I wearing a tie because my wife told me to wear a tie? Am I wearing a tie because silkworms exist in the world? Am I wearing a tie because I'm at a wedding? Am I wearing a tie because I tied the tie on that morning? That's why I'm wearing a tie, right? None of these explanations are mutually exclusive to one another, nor are they competing in any way. So just try to think through layers of explanation and not assume that everything that you hear is attempting to be an exhaustive explanation of the situation that you're trying to describe or the conflict that you're trying to navigate. If you think someone is trying to make something an exhaustive solution, well, then you need to challenge them about that. Okay, and I promise you I won't say anything more about these. Do not derive theology from science. Do not derive science from theology. And wherever possible, make the discussion about Jesus in the Bible, okay? Because that is where people will meet God and find salvation. And that is what we want. We're not interested in winning arguments. Frankly, we're not even interested if evolution happened or it didn't happen, right? What we want is for people to meet the living Lord Jesus and come into his kingdom by putting their trust and faith in him. As in Luke 16, great passage of the Bible, especially good one about evidence and science as well. But the rich man is saying, I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them so that they will not come to this place of torment, right? The rich man's in Hades, and Lazarus is the poor man who was by his door all of his life, but he never helped. And Abraham replies, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. No, Father Abraham, he said, but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent. And what does Jesus say? I mean, it's shocking what he says, right? If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. That is, if someone is not inclined to listen to God in his word, it doesn't matter what evidence you put in front of them. They will continue to refuse to believe. And so, please, make the conversation about Jesus in the Bible wherever you possibly can. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Luis. Now it's time for deliberation, so I'd like to invite, Martin up the stage as well. It works? I turned it off earlier. No, you turned it on. Yep. Okay, it works. Now, can I encourage everyone to send through your questions to the number on the screen? There aren't that many questions so far. So, oh yes, it's coming through. That's good. Must be the number, got to be on the screen. Okay. Now, Martin and Louis, so both of you seems to agree that science and Christianity, they do coexist. There's a lot of common things that you talk about. Humility, being curious, meeting Jesus, that's important. And Louis, you point out in principle that Christianity has nothing to fear from science, and science has nothing to fear from Christianity. So, Martin, I'm keen to hear from your view that you mentioned the scientific methods and human reasoning are fully Christian activities, but they must not get complacent. So what is your biggest concern or your biggest fear from that aspect?
So yes,
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Yep, so I said yes, we do have nothing to fear. There's a lot of overlap, I said, between the methods and findings of science, experimental science, but I also noted that they both start from really radical different starting points. As Lewis also noted. And I suggested that the Christian should do everything from the perspective of a Christian worldview. And so I'm concerned, number one, that we would have to state in our methodology that we're going to use a method that excludes reference to God. Even though we will not always reference God, and we'll talk about so-called laws of gravity and thermodynamics and so on, I still wonder why we would want to construct our method and state it in such a way that it has to exclude God when, as Christians, we want to start from a theistic starting point. And I think, as I noted, that my real concern then is because scientists tend to, I think, not really want to acknowledge the difference between experimental science and historical science. I just want to call them both science. That when we exclude God from science and we use a method stated in terms of methodological naturalism, it then begins to be very hard to talk about God at all, particularly in regard to, as Lewis pointed out, the origin of the universe, the origin of biological life. And so I guess the question I want to ask Lewis for the moment is, I found that helpful. You rightly criticise scientism, yet I wonder in a context where experimental and historical science is not readily distinguished, and methodological naturalism is constrained to find out natural causes, do you not think that methodological naturalism is actually serving scientism in the end?
Yes. I do. This is the problem with all things in this world, is that we twist them to sin and rebellion against God. And so, yes, I mean, I meant to say that explicitly in what I said. I can't remember if I said it or not. But yeah, methodological naturalism is effectively the reason why we now conflate science and naturalism, right? That's the reason. And that's not good. But is it because methodological naturalism was the wrong way to approach science for Francis Bacon in 1600 or something? Well, no, I don't think that it means that it was the wrong approach. I just think that we've done with it what we do with everything, and turned it to evil rather than good. Now, it could be that for that very reason, its day is finished. And it may be that we don't need that anymore because science just does its own thing sort of without thinking about it anymore. I don't know. Yeah, anyway.
Thank you.
I suppose staying on with the topic of methodological naturalism. So there are some common ground in this conflict in terms of parameters. Is there any other beyond what you just mentioned earlier on? Number of days from a set of parameters perspective.
In terms of
Common ground
between
both views. Okay, you mentioned about, Luis, you mentioned about the methodological naturalism is a driving force behind the science advancement, whereas Martin claimed that methodological naturalism is a big part of the reason that the Christianity is banished from the public sphere. So can there be a common ground in this conflict, but within a set of parameters?
Yeah, right. Okay, thanks. Sorry. Well, I'm sure there can be. That's the kind of question that takes a lot of discussion and figuring out, if you know what I mean, between the people who actually have to work it out in practice. Because you could say, okay, well, let's ditch methodological naturalism as a presupposition of science. But, I mean, you could say that in theory, you could say that. I mean, of course, you can't make it happen. But you could say that and say that that would be a better way of doing science. But then you'd have to figure out what other limits, though, would you place on the way we do science and the kinds of answers and solutions we come up with that would still encourage us to take advantage of what I think is in the Christian doctrine of creation, that we should expect to find physical causes for physical phenomena, basically. I mean, as a general rule. So yeah, I think it's just more complicated than saying we could ditch it or not.
It's never a straightforward answer.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
Look, I think methodological naturalism has banished God from the public sphere because methodological naturalism as a method banishes God and says we need to find a natural explanation for this. So I think, but what do you do when you're a Christian, you're at university, what do you say? And I think it's probably better just to talk about the scientific method. Methodological naturalism is not a universal term for the scientific method. It's not found in a lot of textbooks. It was not used by a lot of early Christians. So I wonder if a good way to bridge it would be just to talk about the scientific method. And it's because methodological naturalism is not a neutral term. We've heard from Lewis today that naturalism is not a neutral term. So why add it to the word methodological? It constrains a naturalistic explanation, whereas the scientific method, I think, leaves it open. But one thing I was really interested that Lewis said, and if I can ask him another question, because Lewis, because we're talking about methodological naturalism, you argued that the method, and we won't quibble over the term at the moment, but it's based on the orderliness of creation, which I agree with, and you quoted Genesis 1:11, 1:14, 1:26. Yet in your first talk, you said that Genesis 1 is not historical narrative, but an out-of-time prologue. So how can that form then the basis of an in-time method of scientific analysis?
Yeah, thanks. That's good. That's that is a good question, and one of those that I imagine that someone was formulating in their mind. I think I need to be more clear in my own mind how I would ultimately answer that question. It is a good question and it's an important question. My initial response to that, though, is that while I'm saying it's out of time, I am saying it is God's ideal. It is what He wants for creation. It is the picture of the entirety of creation, and so I think it is actually what we expect, as it were. That is, I think it's not impossible to get there from what I said. Put it that way.
That's good. Now, I suppose I'd like to cover on the topic of evolution. Martin, you argue that the dispute about evolution is not about science, but it's about history, and sometimes science can get entangled up in this dispute. So evolution's biology is not the method of experimental science, but rather it is the method of inference to the best explanations.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, so I'll be keen to hear, Luis, your thought on Martin's point on this.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I've got lots of questions on that as well. But yeah, I mean, one thing just to point out, I mean, on the inference to best explanation, just while we're bashing methodological naturalism for a moment, I mean, the fact is that in science, if you're doing historical, so like, you know, when you come to a murder scene, you really are, hopefully, doing, you know, working at the kind of inference to best explanation sort of methodology. And all explanations are open, really. But when you come to historical science, it's not the inference to the best explanation, it's the inference to the best naturalistic explanation. And it's, so yeah, I mean, it's a problem. I guess my question about the, sort of the issue of historical science, and you know, astronomers engage in a bunch of, you know, in historical science as well. You know, I'm one of those people guilty of this kind of thing in the past, anyway. The question is, that is, it's not history in the regular Department of History at the university history sense, because it's not people, it's not written or human created artifacts, as it were. It's naturally created artifacts, or whatever, however you describe them. And so how, I guess I'm interested to hear what is the method for investigating these things? You know, what should we do for historical science to come to good conclusions? Yeah, that's kind of my. Yeah.
I think that's where, you know, we've got to take seriously the history presented in the Bible, that the Bible doesn't just represent privatized truth or my private religious beliefs, but provides us with the true story of history. We do actually have a record, an infallible historical record of history that we can test scientific stories of history against. Also, on top of that too, I just wonder too, by thinking about the historical science, whether we're using a bit of a bait and switch by using the term methodological naturalism. We talked we talked about the wanting to be truthful, and so we talk to our scientists, our atheistic scientists, and say, yep, I use methodological naturalism as my method, and I'm going to exclude any God hypothesis. We're going to find naturalistic reasons. Good. And then we start to have a discussion about evolution. Oh, no, I don't use that method there. I use my Bible. So I wonder, we do need to, I think, that's why I think it's really important we distinguish the two methods of investigation and realize that the Bible has a really important role to play when it comes to historical evolution, not experimental science. But when it comes to talking about the true history of the world, that's where the scriptures need to be submitted to as God's authoritative word, and that they will have a lot stronger and clearer role in the discussion.
Thanks for that. Now let's turn to, there's quite a few questions coming through our audience member. So this one is for you, Luis. So, now, so we'll be keen to hear from your response to Martin's criticism of mutations or natural selections.
Okay. Yes. All right. So the first thing to say is that I'm not a biologist or a geneticist. So we're just getting it out there. Okay. Okay, logically, as far as I understand, what Martin has said is completely accurate. So in terms of the logic, right, of what Martin described as the way people think about evolution works with mutations and so on, I didn't have any issue with that. That seems straightforward. The idea also that most mutations are lethal mutations and not helpful in getting anywhere in terms of adding new genetic information. Yeah, absolutely. That's what I understand from what I read. So as a method for creating all this wonderful biological diversity, it does seem a little bit hamstrung, as it were. But it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Like, that doesn't mean that it didn't happen, right? That just means that it maybe would take longer to happen, in theory, maybe, than it would otherwise, because that's the kind of nature of the way these things proceed, and therefore it's going to take longer to happen. Now, I don't have any great. I don't make my living off of evolutionary biology. I mean, I just, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. It certainly seems to me like, the evidence that, the evidence for things like common ancestry between species from genetics, not necessarily from fossil record or whatever, seems quite strong to me. So that's one that I feel like is, I kind of can go down that road. As it were, but then the fact is, one thing is, we don't know how long any of this takes, right? No one, as far as I know, no one can put a time on how many generations of this process do you have to go through in order to produce a human being, right? And how long is that going to take in the history of our world? Well, maybe it's going to take longer than 2 billion years or whatever. There are big questions, right? And you can't just tell the story and hope that the questions go away, like you say. I mean, there are big questions like the origins of life. Don't get me started. Like, no one has any idea, right? How you went from chemistry to self-replicating molecules. So how did that happen? When did it happen? These things are huge questions, but it doesn't mean that doesn't, because they're huge questions today, because they've been huge questions for 200 years. It doesn't mean we can't find an answer to them. It doesn't mean we're not going to discover that there's some reasonable number of generations that it requires, and right. So I guess I'm just saying I'm quite happy to be agnostic about these things, but the logic of what Martin's presented I find completely compelling. I mean, in terms of the mutations and everything. Yeah.
I think Lewis has said something really interesting that highlights something very key to evolution, is that we've both agreed that the mechanism of mutation or evolution by genetic mutation is a faulty mechanism. But then the comments sort of often made is that if we give it enough time, maybe it will work. But does it matter how much time we give a faulty mechanism to work? Is it ever going to work? So I think one of the problems that we see with evolution is that time does become a bit of a god. If we give it enough time, if we push it far back enough, 4.5 billion years, 13.8 billion years, right into the mists of history, that maybe we'll just leave it there and hopefully it will work. But I think we've got to wrestle with the fact that if the mechanism's faulty, it doesn't matter how many billions of years you give it, it won't work. In fact, if the mechanism is faulty, if what our textbook has said is true about genetic mutation and genetic entropy, then actually the more time you give it, you're not going to get a better product, but a worse product. Because as we've seen, genetic mutations generally break things down, destroy things, they're deleterious. And so what we're actually seeing over time is not a movement to complexity or betterment, but actually a movement towards entropy. And so I think this is one of the things we'll be careful about the evolution discussion is, what is the God here? Is it time, or is it the God of Genesis 1?
Thank you. Sorry, go on.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I guess I would disagree in calling it a faulty mechanism. I would say it's an incredibly inefficient mechanism, but that doesn't mean that given enough time, whatever that time is, it can't actually produce the goods. It just means that it's less efficient than you might like it to be. Anyway, yeah, I'll stop.
Thanks. Well, I suppose I'll take another questions from the audience. This is for you, Martin. I think 2 questions, pretty similar. So how you respond to scientific evidence about the age of the Earth from, say, carbon dating perspective, paleontology perspective, and how would Jesus view Jesus' positions in terms of the age of the earth? Wow. So it's pretty much the age of the earth.
Look, carbon dating is a really, really good method, but it's a tricky method too, and it doesn't give all the information that we want. And the reason for that is twofold. Carbon dating dates the amount of carbon-14 in an organism, and there's not much. So if you took an organism, your body's mostly made up of carbon-12. So if I was to compare relative amounts, let's say the amount of carbon in my body, carbon-12, is represented by the Empire State Building, then the amount of carbon-14 would be a blade of grass. It's not a lot. So you need very, very sensitive methods in order to test for carbon-14. The second tricky thing about carbon-14 is that it has a half-life of about 5,375 years. So you can check it. It's in the sort of mid-5,000. So that means every 5,500 years, the amount of this little blade of grass, the amount of carbon-14 is going to diminish by half, and then by half and by half. The fact of the matter is, after 50, 60, 70,000 years, you're not going to be able to detect carbon-14. So if you're using carbon-14, you're not going to get back any further really than 50 or 60,000 years. So if someone tells you they've dated a dinosaur to 70 million years ago using carbon-14, they're a liar. You cannot find carbon-14 in a dinosaur that dates back 60, 70 million years. It just doesn't happen. So it's a good tool when working out the date of something, but when you're trying to prove that something's older than it is, it doesn't always work. Remember also, scientists are using the method and they're guided by the presuppositions. If I go into a university, and let's say as a paleontologist, and I date through, say, carbon-14, a dinosaur bone to 5,000 years old. Look, Mary Schweitzer, an evolutionary scientist, has found DNA, blood vessels, and so on in dinosaur bones. But let's say I do that, and let's say I can even prove it. Are they going to let me publish that? Are they going to let me keep my job? Probably not, because it doesn't fit the paradigm. The results still must fit the paradigm. And so another method will be sought after, and another method will be sought after. And we've seen it again and again with dating volcanic rocks, for example, in New Zealand, because we have a lot of volcanoes in New Zealand. There's a lot of disagreement between the different dating methods. What did Jesus think about the age of the earth? Well, I recall Jesus one time saying that God made Adam and Eve, husband and wife, made them from the beginning of creation. Jesus believed that Adam and Eve were husband and wife right from the very beginning. He says right from the beginning he made them man and wife. Jesus believed that Adam and Eve were there right at the beginning, that they are the first two people. Paul also believed that in Acts chapter 17 when he talked about all of humanity coming from one man. And if you look at the writings of Jewish theologians, they also take a very literal approach to Genesis. You won't find it in the rabbinic writings in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, belief in a very, very old earth. You'll find it amongst the Greek writers, certainly, the Greek Adamists, but you won't find it generally among Jewish scholars who tend to interpret it very, very literally. So you find that Jesus did believe, I do believe Jesus did believe in a literal creation, because he often appeals to it. Even when Paul wants to appeal to orderliness in the church, he will appeal to the creation narrative in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and tell us about who was deceived and who was created and so on. And they will again and again go back to Genesis, go back to those, that couple, to provide foundational principles.
Thank you.
Although that is from Genesis 2, Martin, not Genesis 1.
Yeah, Genesis 2, thank you.
It's in the book of Genesis.
Well, he
We
made
do
it-
agree
Which is
that.
the actual
Genesis
beginning of the
1:26,
story.
he made them anyway, but yes.
Let's to be precise.
Thank you.
Now, we'll probably take one last question in the interest of time. So this is for you, Louis. So do Christians and atheists regard contingency in science differently, particularly in human science, such as economics and epidemiology? Do Christian, Do Christian and atheists regard contingency in science differently, especially in human science, such as economics, and epidemiology? Sorry, the font is too small.
No, that's okay. Good question. The short answer is, let's see. Short answer is yes, I guess. I mean, that is. But in practice, the way things work out in terms of just doing your work and doing your research, did we treat things differently? Not that I honestly, I don't think so. I don't know, Martin, do you have any kind of comment on that? Like,
Contingencies are a good example to talk about because they show up our paradigm.
Yeah.
So in the 1970s, for example, evolutionary scientist Mary Schweitzer discovered dinosaur bone. She was able to dissolve the bone, and she was able to find blood tissue. She was able to find evidence of DNA. But DNA doesn't last that long. Your DNA just does not last 65 million years. It barely lasts 1,000 years. So you've got a contingency, but the contingency now has to match the paradigm. And so they started looking for explanations for, well, maybe somehow these blood vessels, this DNA was so hermetically sealed that there's no way any air could get into it that could degrade it at all. So rather than saying, hey, wait, we found blood vessels, we've found DNA here and so on, we know that cannot survive for long. These dinosaurs must not be that old. We've found it even in Triceratops horns. Why not accept the fact that maybe they're not as old as we thought? Maybe they were around when humans... No, that does not fit the paradigm. We can't say that. Get out of the university. So we have to explain this contingency in a way that, that supports the paradigm, that's consistent with the paradigm, even though there are definitely other explanations that are much better. So once again, consistencies are a good thing to look at because they highlight where the paradigm is. Because when there's a contingency, you'll find it's always explained in light of the paradigm, and usually the historical evolutionary one.
Yeah, and I guess it's probably worth saying as well that just applies across the board. It's not about whether you're Christian or not. That is, the paradigms control the publications basically, and it just and the hiring processes, and so anyone who wants to say something different from the paradigm is largely going to be punished in some way, shape, or form. I mean,
It's never an easy answer to that. Now, before we wrap up, is there any final thought or highlights in 30 seconds? Each of you can felt that you would like to share with the audience. Yeah, any highlights for today in 30 seconds that you feel are the key elements for today's session?
I think this has been a wonderful discussion. I hope it's been a really good example of how Christian brothers can discuss this without raising the temperature, raising their voices, getting angry, that we can listen together. See, we together are the body of Christ. We need each other. Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, for example. We don't have a monopoly on the truth. And so I just really think what Lewis said before was really, really important about the need for humility, about the need to listen to one another, to hear one another out thoughtfully, to enter into dialogue. I also agree with Lewis that Christ is the most important thing. And I don't want to define someone's Christianity by how much theology they have and what their beliefs are about origins. I want to know, have they embraced Jesus Christ by saving faith alone, by grace alone, in Christ alone? However, I do want to encourage you to keep thinking too about the implications of evolutionary thinking for our understanding of the gospel. But I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's really got me excited. I've really appreciated your warmth today, Lewis. I've really appreciated the hospitality of CrossCulture, and I appreciated all of you coming out to listen, to engage, to ask wonderful questions. It's been just such a thrill to have the conversation, so thank you.
want to highlight, I think, one thing that Martin's highlighted, which is the importance of worldviews, getting that right, developing, thinking, investigating other people's worldviews, helping them see what they think and why they think it. But because of the fact that we live in this subjective world, it matters what your paradigm is for understanding the world. And so think about it consciously and have a Christian one. And then secondly, in terms of just discussion, I think for Christians to have discussion, just make sure you've got the Bible open, talking to each other. That's one of the encouraging things about today. Is just the obvious concern for helpfully, correctly representing what God has said in His Word, and so that's in order to have a healthy discussion, right? That's what you need. It's a Bible open between Christian people trying to get to the bottom of whatever it is. And so, yeah, I just encourage you and yeah, just so happy to be part of this because I feel like that, we were able to do that here. And so it's great. So again, yeah, thanks to CrossCulture. Like, this is a special place, people, right? This doesn't happen in lots of other churches anywhere, right? Like, this is a really special kind of thing. And so let me encourage all of you. And again, yeah, thank you for coming and being part of it all.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Dr. Louis Jones and Dr. Martin Williams. Thank you so much. So friends, we hope you've gained more understanding on the doctrine of creations and to consider the issues from the long age and also from the young earth perspective. So we did not answer all the questions that you sent through this morning and this afternoon, and we endeavor to have them answered by our speaker, and we'll revert back to you in times. So we appreciate your feedback as well. So our team will send out a survey to your registered email address, and we will also provide the responses to the questions through the email. Now, for those who didn't have a chance to register, so if you can send your email address to the address on the screen. Yep, it's on the screen, and we'll contact you through that. And we want to thank our volunteer from various life groups for putting today's symposium together, especially our AV team, our usher, as well as our catering team. So they did a fantastic job. So thank you, everyone. So this concludes the formality for this afternoon. Please feel free to stay back for fellowships and also join us for a cup of nice coffee and tea. And there's also home-made muffin, and also there's some leftover chicken rice. So feel free to bring home if you wish. Thank you, everyone. Have a blessed day.
Thank you, Louis. Yeah, thanks, Mark. It's good to see you in the flesh. Irene, great job. You did a fantastic job. I hope you're getting paid the big money for this.